The morning Raymond Holloway told his wife to pack her bags. He was standing in the doorway of the master bedroom of the house on Whitfield Lane in Greenwich, Connecticut, wearing the expression of a man who had just made the most expensive mistake of his life without knowing it yet. His mother, Dolores Holloway, was standing behind him in the hallway in her ivory Chanel cardigan with her arms crossed and her chin elevated at the specific angle she reserved for moments when she believed she had won something, which was an angle Serena had been watching across dinner tables and living room sofas for 4 years and which she had come to understand, with the patient clarity of someone who catalogs everything, as the angle of a woman who had never once in 71 years examined whether the things she believed she had won were actually hers to take. Raymond was 41 years old and he had the jaw of a man who looked decisive and the spine of a man who was not, and he had spent the 4 years of his marriage to Serena performing the role of husband while outsourcing the actual decisions of his life to the woman standing behind him in the Chanel cardigan, and tonight, in this doorway, the performance had finally collapsed into what it had always been underneath. "I think it's best if you go," Raymond said. He had rehearsed this. Serena could hear the rehearsal in it, the specific flatness of words practiced until they feel like someone else's. Mom needs to be comfortable in her own home. And clearly this isn't working. Dolores from the hallway said, "I've been saying this for 2 years. This house has always been a Holloway house. It was never meant for." She paused, with the particular pause of a woman who has chosen her next word and wants credit for not saying it. "For an arrangement like this." Serena was sitting on the edge of the bed. She was wearing the cream cashmere sweater she had put on that morning when the house was still, before Dolores had arrived at 11 with her overnight bag and her manufactured crisis, the story about the broken furnace at her Darien house, the distress that had been, Serena had noted, remarkably dry-eyed, the specific helplessness of a woman who has decided she needs to be accommodated and has arranged the circumstances accordingly. She had been sitting on the edge of the bed for 4 minutes, since Raymond had come in with his rehearsed words and his mother's agenda and his carefully arranged expression of a man doing something difficult and necessary, and she had not yet responded, and in the silence of that non-response something had been accumulating in the room that neither Raymond nor his mother had the perception to feel. On the bed beside her was a leather portfolio, tan, thick, monogrammed with the initials of the trust company that had prepared its contents 9 years ago, when Serena's grandmother had died and left the specific, carefully structured financial legacy that Raymond Holloway had never been shown in full, and that his mother had never been told about at all, because some information belongs to the person it protects and to no one else until the moment when it needs to be shown to everyone. Serena looked at her husband. She looked at her mother-in-law in the hallway. She looked at the leather portfolio beside her on the bed. She thought about 4 years of Sunday dinners and strategic helplessness and whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms and the slow, patient, grinding work of a woman who had decided, before the marriage was 6 months old, that Serena was an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be known. She thought about Raymond and his rehearsed words and the 4 years of watching him choose, every time the choice was offered, the approval of the woman in the hallway over the life he had promised at an altar in front of 200 people. She picked up the portfolio. She held it in her lap for 1 moment. Then she opened it. But to understand what was in that portfolio and why it was there, and what it meant that Dolores Holloway had spent 4 years trying to remove Serena from a house that had never, not for a single day, belonged to anyone named Holloway, you have to go back. You have to go back to a woman named Margaret Voss, who was Serena's grandmother, and to a Tuesday afternoon in October 9 years ago when Serena had sat in an attorney's office in Midtown Manhattan and understood, for the first time, what it meant to be truly protected. Before all of that, before the portfolio and the attorney's office and the 9 years of careful and visible security, there was the beginning of the marriage which had looked from the outside like the kind of beginning that people who believe in things like fate point to as evidence. Serena had met Raymond Holloway at a fundraising dinner for a children's hospital foundation in Midtown, at a round table of 8 where the conversation had been exactly what fundraising dinners produce: generous, pleasant, fundamentally unchallenging, and Raymond had been the person to her left who had said something genuinely funny about the entree, and then asked her a real question about the work she did and listened to the answer with the focused attention of someone who was actually interested rather than performing interest while waiting for their turn to speak. He was attractive in the specific, reliable way of men who take care of themselves without vanity, tall, well-dressed without being showy, a clean Jaeger LeCoultre on his left wrist that suggested good taste rather than performance. He worked in commercial insurance, senior level, the kind of work that requires genuine analytical skill and produces comfortable income without the specific drama of finance or law. He was 37 years old and he seemed, that evening, like a man who had arrived at a version of himself that was settled and real. She had believed this. She had chosen to believe it, which was not the same thing, and she understood the difference, and she had chosen it anyway because she was 34 years old and she had spent her adult life building her career and her financial independence and the specific self-sufficient internal architecture of someone who had learned early that you could not count on other people to see you clearly, and she had done all of that so well and for so long that she had arrived at a point where what she wanted was not to be protected or provided for. She had those things, but simply to be chosen. Simply to be the person that someone looked at across the table and decided they wanted to be near for the rest of their life. Raymond had looked at her across the table and decided that. She had felt it. It had been real. What she had not fully assessed in those early months was the third person in the relationship. Dolores Holloway was a woman who had built her identity so completely around her son that the arrival of any person who required Raymond to orient his primary loyalty elsewhere was experienced not as a natural life transition, but as a threat requiring immediate and sustained response. She was 71 years old, widowed for 12 years, and she had spent those 12 years with Raymond as the organizing principle of her emotional life in a way that had started as grief and coping and had calcified, over time, into something that required management and accommodation from Raymond, and that Raymond had never, in 12 years, seriously questioned or resisted, because questioning it would have required him to look directly at what it was, which was not something Raymond was constituted to do. She was not obvious about it. This was important to understand. Dolores Holloway was not the cartoon mother-in-law of bad television, not openly hostile, not crudely dismissive, not the kind of woman who says directly what she means and can therefore be directly answered. She was something more sophisticated and more difficult, a woman who operated entirely through the language of need and frailty and hurt feelings, who communicated her agenda through sighs and pauses and carefully constructed fragilities that left Raymond in the position of constantly managing her emotional state, and that left Serena, when she tried to name what was happening, sounding like someone complaining about a 71-year-old woman's feelings, which was a position that made her look unreasonable no matter how carefully she described the actual pattern. The first year of the marriage had been the year of establishment, Dolores establishing, through 100 small persistent gestures, that her relationship with Raymond was primary and Serena's was secondary, and doing it so gradually and so wrapped in the language of family love that Raymond had genuinely not seen it as a pattern, or had seen it and chosen not to name it, which amounted to the same thing from Serena's position. Sunday dinners at Dolores's Darien house that expanded from once a month to every week without discussion. Calls from Dolores to Raymond that arrived at 9 in the evening, when they were in the middle of their own conversations, and that Raymond answered every time. Decisions about the Greenwich house, their house, the house they had moved into after the wedding, the house that Raymond believed was his and that Dolores had taken to referring to as the Holloway house, with the particular possessiveness of someone claiming ownership through repetition, that Dolores offered opinions on without being asked and that Raymond absorbed and acted on without consulting Serena. The Greenwich house on Whitfield Lane was a 1920s colonial on 2 acres, 6 bedrooms, the kind of property that accumulates character over a century of careful maintenance and becomes something that newer construction cannot replicate. Wide planked oak floors, original millwork, a library with built-in shelves from floor to ceiling and a fireplace that worked, a kitchen that had been renovated twice in 50 years in ways that respected rather than erased what it had been. It sat on a tree-lined street in one of Greenwich's established neighborhoods, the kind of street where houses changed hands rarely and were known by their families rather than their addresses. Raymond had believed, when he moved into it after the wedding, that he understood where it came from, Serena's family. He knew, something to do with a trust, a lucky inheritance, the vague comfortable backstory that men sometimes construct around their wives' financial circumstances when they haven't been given the specific details and haven't asked, because asking would require them to sit with the specific discomfort of understanding that their wife's financial foundation is more substantial than their own. What he knew was this: the house was in a trust. It had come from Serena's side. They lived in it together. Beyond that, he had not pushed, partly because Serena had not offered more and partly because Raymond Holloway was a man who was comfortable with comfortable ambiguity, which is a specific kind of intellectual laziness that presents as easygoing and costs you eventually. What he did not know What Dolores had never been told because there was no reason to tell her and every reason not to, was the precise structure of what Serena owned and how thoroughly it had been constructed to belong to no one but her. Margaret Voss had been Serena's maternal grandmother, a woman who had spent 60 years watching the women in her family, and the women in the families around her lose the things they had built or been given the moment they attached their lives to men who did not protect those things with the same care they had been built or given with. Margaret had grown up in the Depression, had married well by the standards of her era, had watched her own mother lose a property in a divorce that should have been hers to keep, and had spent her adult life doing something that the women of her generation did not often do openly, and that she did with absolute quiet consistency. She had built financial structures designed to protect the women who came after her. Not out of bitterness. Out of the specific, practical love of a woman who understood that love without protection is a sentiment rather than a foundation, and that foundations are what you need when the sentiment runs out. She had established the Voss Family Trust in 1987, funded initially with the proceeds of a real estate portfolio she had assembled over 30 years, and she had structured it with the help of an estate attorney in Manhattan named Walter Osman, who was then 62 years old and who had spent his career doing exactly this kind of work and who understood, without requiring it to be explained, what Margaret was building and why. The trust owned properties. It owned investment accounts. It owned, after 1998, the house on Whitfield Lane in Greenwich, which Margaret had purchased in cash after it came on the market for the first time in 40 years, and which she had placed immediately into the trust with the clean, unambiguous documentation of someone who has done this before and knows exactly how to make sure it stays done. Serena had been named as the trust's controlling beneficiary in the amendment Margaret had filed in 2003, when Serena was 26 and had demonstrated, in the assessment of both Margaret and Walter Osman, the specific combination of financial understanding and personal judgment that qualified a person to be trusted with something real. Margaret had called her to the Manhattan office, not her home the office, because Margaret believed that some conversations required the formality of a professional setting to convey their full weight, and she had sat across from Serena at the conference table and said, "I am giving you something that no one can take from you as long as you don't let them. The structure will protect you. But the structure only works if you understand it completely and never sign anything you haven't read, and never let anyone make you feel that what is yours requires their approval to remain yours." Serena had been 26 years old and she had looked at her grandmother across the conference table and felt, with the specific clarity of receiving something that is both a gift and a responsibility, that she understood completely. She had said, "I won't." Margaret had said, "I know." They had shaken hands, which was not something grandmothers and granddaughters typically did, and which was exactly right. The house on Whitfield Lane was owned by the Voss Family Trust. The trust was controlled by Serena. Serena's name as trustee and controlling beneficiary was on every document. The property tax bills came to the trust's registered address, a post office box managed by Walter Osman's firm, now run by his daughter Claire, who had taken over the practice 8 years ago and who had the same precise discretion her father had brought to it. The deed was in the leather portfolio that had lived in the safe in Serena's home office. Her office, the one at the back of the house that Dolores had twice suggested be converted into a guest room for her visits, since the day they had moved in. Raymond had never asked to see the deed. Raymond had never asked about the structure of the trust. Raymond had been comfortable with comfortable ambiguity, and the comfort had cost him the understanding of the single most important financial fact about the life he was living, which was that the house his mother was standing in when she called it the Holloway house had never, not for one day, belonged to anyone named Holloway. The second year of the marriage had been the year of escalation, in which Dolores's persistent small gestures had grown into a sustained campaign that anyone paying close attention could have identified as exactly what it was, though Raymond did not pay close attention to anything that required him to reach a conclusion he would then have to act on. Dolores had begun appearing at the Greenwich house without calling first, arriving at the door on Tuesday afternoons and Saturday mornings with casseroles and the specific energy of someone inserting themselves into a domestic space with the confidence of someone who believes the space belongs to them. She had developed opinions about Serena's housekeeping that she delivered to Raymond in private, and that Raymond received and held in the specific way of a man collecting grievances he had not been asked to collect, and did not know what to do with except store them in the growing account he maintained of reasons why his mother might have a point. She had taken to referring to the house in conversation with her Darien friends as Raymond's house in Greenwich, The possessive doing exactly the work it was designed to do, establishing a narrative before anyone thought to question it. Serena had addressed it directly twice. The first time 6 months into the pattern, she had sat down with Raymond on a Sunday evening and said, with the clear, unhedging directness she brought to all conversations that mattered, "Your mother is here 3 times a week without being invited, and she is making decisions about this house as though she lives here. I need you to address that with her." Raymond had said, "She's lonely, Serena. She just lost her bridge partner and she's been having a hard time. Can we give her some grace?" Serena had looked at him for a moment and then said, "She's been lonely for 12 years, Raymond. That's not what's happening here." Raymond had looked at the table and said he would talk to his mother, and had not talked to his mother. The second time, 18 months later, Serena had said, "I've asked you twice to address the dynamic with your mother and twice you have not done it. I need to know whether you understand that this marriage requires you to make a choice about where your primary loyalty is, because right now you are choosing her consistently and I am asking you to choose me." Raymond had said, "That's not fair. You're asking me to choose between my wife and my mother. That's not something a person should have to do." Serena had said very quietly, "You are already making the choice, Raymond. You make it every Sunday dinner and every Tuesday afternoon and every time she says something about this house and you say nothing. I am asking you to make it consciously." Raymond had looked at her with the expression of a man encountering a complexity he had not prepared for and had said, "I'll talk to her." He had not talked to her. The third year had been the year of Serena's quiet preparation. Not dramatic. Not reactive. She had called Claire Osman at the trust management firm and had a 2-hour conversation about the current documentation of the trust and whether it was in the condition it needed to be in. She had updated the beneficiary designations on every account. She had reviewed the deed and confirmed, with Claire's confirmation as a second verification, that every document was clean and current and that the ownership structure of the house on Whitfield Lane was, as it had always been, legally unassailable. She had moved the leather portfolio from the safe in her office to a fireproof lockbox. She had made a copy and sent it to Claire's firm for their records. She had done all of this with the quiet, methodical attention of someone who learned from her grandmother that protection is not paranoia. It is preparation, and preparation is love for your future self. She had also in those months begun paying attention to what she was watching with a new quality of attention, not looking for reasons to end the marriage but looking clearly at what the marriage actually was, which was different from looking for a reason. She loved Raymond in the way that you love someone you chose when you were ready to choose someone real, not blindly, not without the evidence of their actual qualities, but with the full knowledge of a person who had decided that this person's genuine good qualities were worth the work of the difficult ones. She had married him knowing he was conflict avoidant. She had married him knowing his relationship with his mother was complicated. She had married him because she had believed, on the basis of everything she had seen of him in private, that when it came to the moment, the real moment, the moment when he would have to choose, he would choose the life he had promised rather than the comfort he was accustomed to. She had been wrong about that. She was honest enough to understand in those quiet months of preparation that this was a real error of her own judgment and not solely a failure of his character, that she had seen the signs and had assessed them as manageable rather than fundamental, and that the assessment had been incorrect. This did not make her angry. It made her sad in the specific way of someone grieving something real, and she let herself feel that sadness with the same clear-eyed honesty she brought to everything, without dressing it up as something simpler or pretending it wasn't there. And she prepared, because her grandmother had taught her that clarity and preparation were what you had when sentiment ran out, and sentiment was running out. The fourth year had been the year of Dolores's final push, which had arrived with the specific timing of someone who has been watching for the right moment and has decided that the right moment is now. Raymond had been offered a position with a firm in Chicago, a significant promotion, genuinely exciting in professional terms, and had announced it at dinner in early September with the specific energy of someone who has already made a decision and is presenting it as though it is still open for discussion. He wanted to take it. He wanted them to move to Chicago. He had not, in any of the weeks he had apparently been considering this, asked Serena what she thought about leaving Greenwich, leaving the house, leaving the life they had built here, because Raymond was a man who arrived at his own conclusions and then sought endorsement rather than input. Serena had said, "I need time to think about this." She had a professional life in Greenwich, consulting work, board positions, the specific network of a woman who had spent 15 years building something real in a specific place. She had the house. She had the trust. She had the roots that Raymond, who had moved 4 times in 12 years before meeting her, and who experienced mobility as freedom rather than loss, had never needed to grow. She had said, "I need time to think about this," and Raymond had heard this as obstruction and had gone to his mother, and his mother had heard it as the opportunity she had been building toward for 4 years. Dolores had moved with the efficiency of someone executing a plan she had been preparing for a long time. The furnace story arrived 3 weeks after the Chicago conversation, on a Tuesday morning when Serena was working in her office, the office Dolores had twice tried to convert into a guest room, and Raymond was at work. She had arrived with her overnight bag and her ivory Chanel cardigan and her dry-eyed distress, and Raymond had been called, and Raymond had come home at noon and said, "Of course you'll stay, Mom, as long as you need." And Serena had looked at him from the kitchen doorway and said nothing, because she understood, with the complete clarity of someone who has been watching a pattern long enough to see its entire shape, that this was not a furnace story. This was a maneuver. And the maneuver was not finished yet. It finished 4 days later. 4 days of Dolores in the house, reorganizing the kitchen without asking, commenting on Serena's cooking with the soft, regretful tone of a woman who considers herself a superior alternative, telling Raymond over breakfast about things that needed to be addressed, in the house and the marriage and the life he was living, delivered in the specific language of maternal concern that sounds like love and functions like pressure. 4 days of Raymond receiving all of this and storing it in the account he maintained and saying nothing to Serena and saying nothing to his mother, until the 4th evening when Dolores had apparently decided the account was full enough, and had said to Raymond in the kitchen after dinner while Serena was upstairs, in a voice that Serena had heard from the landing because the house was quiet and sound traveled in the way it travels in houses that are 100 years old and have never been insulated against the truth. "Raymond, I cannot stay here. I cannot watch this. This is a Holloway house and it has never been the right place for this kind of..." She stopped. The pause. The chosen word not said. "You need to tell her. You need to end this. I cannot be comfortable here while she is here. And this is my family's house and I have a right to be comfortable in it." And Raymond, who had never once in 41 years told his mother that something she wanted was something she could not have, had said, "Okay, Mom. I'll talk to her." He had come upstairs. He had stood in the doorway of the master bedroom in his rehearsed expression. He had said his rehearsed words. "Pack your bags. Mom needs to be comfortable. This isn't working." And Dolores had stood behind him in the hallway with her arms crossed and her chin at the winning angle, and the expression of a woman who has arrived at the destination she has been navigating toward for 4 years. Serena sat on the edge of the bed with the leather portfolio in her lap. She looked at her husband. She looked at her mother-in-law. She felt underneath the sadness and the clarity and the specific grief of a marriage ending not with a dramatic event but with the final irreversible revelation of what it had always been. Something that was almost like relief, the relief of someone who has been preparing for a difficult thing for a long time and has just been told that the time is now. She opened the portfolio. Inside was the deed to the house at Whitfield Lane, Greenwich, Connecticut. The official recorded deed, stamped and certified by the Greenwich Town Clerk's office, bearing the legal description of the property and the name of the owner in the clean, unambiguous language of property law. The owner was not Raymond Holloway. The owner was not the Holloway family. The owner was the Voss Family Trust, an irrevocable trust established in 1987, with Serena Margaret Voss Holloway as sole trustee and controlling beneficiary, with a legal interest in the property dating to 1998, 6 years before Raymond had ever heard Serena's name, 23 years before he had stood at an altar and promised to choose her, and 4 years before Dolores Holloway had decided this was her family's house and she had a right to be comfortable in it. Serena held the deed out toward Raymond. She did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She said in the voice she used when delivering information that is important and should be heard clearly, "Before you say anything else, I think you should read this." Raymond looked at the document with the expression of a man who does not yet understand what he is looking at but can feel, in the specific way that people feel things before they understand them, that it is significant. He took it. He read the first page. He read the second page. He read the ownership line. He read it again. The color in his face changed in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. Dolores had moved from the hallway into the doorway. She could not see the document from where she was standing. "Raymond, what is that? What is she showing you?" "The deed to this house," Serena said. She looked at Dolores with the full direct gaze of someone who has been waiting 4 years to look at this woman without the performance of managed diplomacy. "This house belongs to the Voss Family Trust. It has belonged to the Voss Family Trust since 1998. My name is on it as trustee and controlling beneficiary. It has never, at any point in its history, belonged to anyone named Holloway." She paused. "It is not your family's house. It was never your family's house. And you are a guest in it, or you were, at my discretion." Dolores's chin came down from its winning angle for the first time in 4 days. She looked at Raymond. "Raymond, that can't be." "It's the recorded deed," Serena said. "You're welcome to verify it with the Greenwich Town Clerk's office. Claire Osman at Voss Trust Management in Midtown can provide any additional documentation you need. Everything is in order." Raymond was still holding the deed. He looked like a man standing in a room that has just changed its dimensions in a way he cannot account for. Everything in the same position, but the proportions fundamentally different. The space he thought he knew revealing itself as something he had never actually measured. "You never told me," he said. His voice was quiet. "You never told me the house was in a trust." "You never asked," Serena said. "In 4 years, you never asked about the ownership structure of the home we lived in. You assumed. Your mother assumed. You built an entire argument on an assumption that you never verified." She looked at him steadily. "You told me to pack my bags and leave a house that legally belongs to my trust. I think what actually needs to happen is a conversation with an attorney." The silence in the room had a different quality now than the silence that had preceded it. The silence before had been the silence of Serena receiving something. This silence was the silence of Raymond and Dolores standing in a room that had just revealed itself as not theirs, the specific physical silence of people whose certainty has been removed from beneath them. Dolores said, "Raymond." Just his name, in the specific tone she used when she needed him to do something and was not able to do it herself, the tone that had worked for 41 years and was, in this particular moment, simply a sound in a room where the geometry had changed. Raymond did not respond to his mother. He was still looking at the deed. He was doing the specific cognitive work of a man integrating information that requires him to rebuild a structure he thought was solid. The 4 years of dinners and mornings and the life he had believed was his in a house he had believed was theirs, on a foundation that had just revealed itself as belonging to someone else entirely. He said, "I need to sit down." "You can sit in the kitchen," Serena said. "I'm going to call Claire." She stood from the bed. She picked up the leather portfolio with both hands and held it with the ease of someone holding something that belongs to them and has always belonged to them. She looked at her mother-in-law in the doorway one more time. The Chanel cardigan and the crossed arms and the chin that had come down from its angle and was not finding its way back up, and she said, "You should arrange for your furnace to be repaired. I'll need the guest room back by Thursday." She walked out of the bedroom. She walked through the hallway past the family photographs on the wall. Her photographs, her frames, her walls, and down the stairs of the house that her grandmother had placed in a trust 23 years ago for exactly this kind of moment. The kind of moment that Margaret Voss had spent 60 years watching arrive for unprepared women and had decided, with the specific love of a woman who understood that love requires infrastructure, that no woman in her family would ever face unprepared. Again, she went to her office, the office, not the guest room, and she called Claire Osman. Claire picked up on the second ring. She always did when the call came from the Greenwich number. "Tell me," she said, because they had worked together long enough to skip the preamble when it mattered. "I'm going to need you to prepare a comprehensive documentation package of the trust's ownership of the Whitfield Lane property," Serena said, "including the original deed, all subsequent amendments, the current beneficiary designation, and the property tax records for the past 10 years. I'm also going to need you to recommend a family law attorney." A brief pause. "Do you have a timeline?" "This week. I'll have the documentation to you by tomorrow morning. For family law, I'd suggest Margaret Reyes at Reyes Whitfield. She's handled trust-adjacent divorce matters for us before. She's excellent." "Thank you, Claire. Are you all right?" Serena looked out the window of her office at the back garden. The garden she had planted the second spring they were here. The roses along the back fence that had taken 2 years to establish and were extraordinary now. The kitchen garden along the south wall that she maintained herself because she liked the specific physical work of it. The copper beech at the far end that had been there for 60 years and would be there for 60 more. Her garden. Her copper beech. Her house. "I'm fine," she said. "I've been ready for this for a while." Margaret Reyes of Reyes Whitfield was, as Claire had promised, excellent. She was 53 years old. A compact woman with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain and a manner of speaking in meetings that was so precisely calibrated between warmth and authority that opposing counsel consistently underestimated her until it was too late to adjust. She reviewed the trust documentation in a single evening and called Serena the following morning at 8:15 to say, "This is as clean as I've ever seen. Your grandmother's attorney knew what he was doing. There is no mechanism by which the house can be considered a marital asset. It was held in an irrevocable trust before the marriage. It was never commingled with marital funds. There is no record of any marital contribution to its upkeep that isn't documented as living expenses rather than equity contribution." She paused. "Your husband has no claim. His mother never had a claim. The house is yours as completely as anything can be yours." Serena said. "I know. I just needed it confirmed in the language he'll need to hear it in." Margaret said. "I'll prepare a letter." The letter went to Raymond's attorney. Raymond had hired an attorney, which was the first decisive thing Serena had seen him do in 4 years, which she observed without irony, within 48 hours. Raymond's attorney reviewed it and called Raymond and said, in the professionally neutral tone of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have to deliver, "The house is hers. There's no argument to make. The trust documentation is airtight and predates the marriage by 6 years. I'd recommend we focus on the other aspects of the settlement and not spend money litigating something we cannot win." Raymond had called Serena the evening after the attorney call. He had not called from his mother's house in Darien, where he had gone the night of the deed, leaving without packing everything, leaving in the specific stunned haste of someone who needs to be somewhere else. He had called from a hotel in Stamford, which she knew because the number had a Stamford area code, and because Raymond was not a man with a sophisticated plan for where to go when his life reorganized itself without warning. He had said, "I'm sorry." Just that first. Then, I handled the last 4 years badly. I know that." Serena had been in the library, the room with the floor-to-ceiling shelves and the fireplace that worked, the room she loved most in the house because it had the quality of all rooms that have been used for reading for many years, a particular warmth that is not temperature, a particular density of atmosphere that books and thought create. She had a glass of wine and the fire was going and she had been reading when the phone rang, and she had looked at the Stamford number for a moment before answering. She said, "Yes, you did. I don't know if there's any." He stopped. He started again. "Is there anything I can do? Any way to?" "No," she said. "Not cruelly." With the clean, clear finality of someone who has thought about this and arrived at an answer that is settled. "I loved the person I thought you were capable of being, Raymond, but you weren't willing to do the work of being that person when it cost you something. I can't build a life with someone who makes choices from the place you make them from." She paused. "I hope you figure out how to make them differently. I genuinely mean that." He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "I know you do." And the call had ended. The divorce was handled by Margaret Reyes with the methodical efficiency of someone who knows the landscape completely and has prepared every document in advance. Raymond's claim on the house was withdrawn without litigation, as his attorney had recommended. The marital assets, Raymond's pension, their joint accounts, the furniture and belongings accumulated over 4 years, were divided fairly, which in this case meant Serena took what was hers and Raymond took what was his, and the things that were genuinely shared were valued and split without drama, because when a marriage ends between 2 people who are both honest about what happened, the legal process does not need to be a war. It needs to be an accounting. Margaret Reyes was excellent at accountings. Dolores had called once, 3 weeks after the night of the deed. Serena had looked at the number on her phone and had not answered and had not called back, because there was nothing to say that the deed had not already said more clearly and permanently than anything Serena could add. Dolores's furnace had apparently been repaired, or had never been broken. since the story had served its purpose and the purpose was now obsolete. She was in her Darien house with her crossed arms and her Chanel cardigan, and the narrative she would tell her friends about what had happened, which would be a version in which she had been wronged by a woman who had not understood the importance of family, and which would be, like all the stories Dolores told about herself, both completely believed and entirely beside the point. Raymond moved to Chicago in February. He took the job. He found an apartment in Lincoln Park. He called Serena once 6 months after the divorce was finalized, to say that he was doing well and that he had started seeing a therapist, which he said with the specific self-consciousness of a man admitting to something he would have considered unnecessary a year earlier, and that he now understood he should have done a long time ago. Serena had wished him well and meant it, because she was a woman who wished people well when she was finished with them, not because it cost her nothing but because it was true and she did not say things that were not true. The house on Whitfield Lane was hers. It had always been hers. In the spring following the divorce, she hired a contractor to restore the original oak floors in the upstairs hallway, which had been covered with carpet that someone, she had never fully investigated when, but she had her suspicions, had installed over the original boards at some point in the previous decade, and which Serena had wanted gone since the day she moved in. Underneath the carpet, the boards were magnificent, wide-planked, original, the specific color of old oak that has been walking on for 100 years and has only become richer for it. She stood in the hallway when the contractor finished and looked at the floor and felt, with the specific satisfaction of something restored to what it was always meant to be, entirely right. She had the kitchen garden expanded. She had the copper beech at the back of the garden examined by an arborist who told her it was healthy and had another 40 years in it, which she found unreasonably satisfying. She had the library cataloged properly, a project she had been meaning to do for 2 years, and that took 3 weekends and produced the specific domestic pleasure of knowing exactly where everything is. She filled it with more books. She used the fireplace more often. She sat in it in the evenings with wine and the particular quiet of a house that belongs to you completely, and that you do not have to share with anyone who does not deserve to be there. She had friends for dinner, real friends, the ones who had been watching the marriage with the careful concern of people who love you enough to stay present and loyal enough not to say "I told you so" when the thing they feared comes to pass. She had her cousin Natalie, who had known about the trust since Margaret's death, and who had spent 4 years doing the specific labor of care that consists of not saying the things you think when the person you love is not ready to hear them. She had her work, which had continued through everything: the consulting, the board positions, the specific professional life of a woman who had built something real in a specific place and who had never once, even in the worst of the 4 years, allowed what was happening at home to compromise what she was building outside of it. She had, on the mantelpiece of the library fireplace, a photograph of her grandmother, Margaret Voss, in her 60s, standing outside what appeared to be a courthouse, not the Greenwich one, somewhere else, somewhere she had apparently needed to be for a legal reason that Serena had never known the full story of and would now never be able to ask about. She was wearing a well-cut wool coat and her hair was pinned back, and she was looking directly at the camera with the expression of a woman who has just finished something difficult and important, and is not going to pretend it was easy or that it didn't matter. The expression of someone who knows exactly what they are standing on. Serena looked at the photograph on evenings when she had wine and the fire and the restored oak floors and the quiet of a house that was and had always been hers, and she thought about her grandmother's belief that love requires infrastructure, that protection is preparation, that the foundation is what you need when the sentiment runs out. She thought about the leather portfolio in the safe in her office, still there, returned to it after the divorce was finalized, resting in the dark with the patient permanence of something that does not need to be looked at regularly to be doing its work. She thought about Margaret sitting across from her at the conference table 20 years ago, shaking her hand and saying "I know." She thought she was right. She thought, "I understood." She thought, the foundation held. Outside the library window, the back garden was beginning its spring, the roses coming back along the fence, the kitchen garden waiting for the last frost date, the copper beech with its 40 years ahead of it going tender green at the branch tips in the specific way of things that are old and rooted and entirely, permanently, unmovably where they are supposed to be. She looked at it. She picked up her wine. She went back to her book. The house was hers. The garden was hers. The floors and the library and the fireplace and the copper beech and all the years ahead in this specific place that had been prepared for her by a woman who understood that love without infrastructure is sentiment, and that sentiment is not enough, and that enough is what you build when you are paying attention to what actually matters and to what it actually costs to make sure the things that matter remain yours. She turned the page. The fire crackled. Outside, the copper beech moved very slightly in the April wind, just the tips of its branches just enough to be alive, and was still again as it had been for 60 years, as it would be for 60 more.